Okay. So I wanted to talk today not about this week's Torah reading, but instead about this teshuvah, this legal paper that just came out last week from the Law Committee of the Conservative Movement. So there's a bunch I want to say about this, and as I'm talking, if you have a question, just go to chat and type a question and I'll see it. Or if you want, you can wave your hand frantically and eventually I'll see it out of the corner of my eye, and then you can I'll unmute you to ask a question. But one other person joining. So this statement that I wanted to read, to go over today, is about streaming on Shabbat. Now, what we've decided to do as a synagogue, or essentially what I decided to do to make it the policy of the synagogue, is what we're doing right now is Zooming Mincha and Kabbalat Shabbat, the afternoon service and the opening service of Shabbat, Fridays at 6 o'clock. And I'll get to the reasoning behind that. I mean, that's the whole topic of this paper, because candlelighting, Shabbos doesn't begin now until about 8 o'clock. And so therefore, 6 o'clock Zooming, it's still a weekday. It's not technically Shabbat yet. The issue is the live streaming on Shabbat. So there are conservative synagogues that don't live stream at all, whether they had the technology or not to do it. They do not live stream at all. There are synagogues like ours that live stream, but do not Zoom on Shabbat. And there are conservative synagogues that Zoom on Shabbat. So what this paper, so I sent out the link to it, and I have it here in front of me. I thought of sharing the screen and having it up. It's not necessary. And you can refer to the paper at your leisure. And just welcome Gabe Eber here too. Okay, great. Everybody is muted. Good. So let me just say a couple words of background. What a teshuvah is. Teshuvah in Hebrew, in rabbinic times, means repentance, but it also means answer, as opposed to she'elah, which is a question, and a teshuvah, which is an answer. The rabbinic literature, there are a variety of forms of rabbinic literature, mainly the Mishnah and the Gemara. So the interpretations that derive Jewish law in two books known as the Mishnah and the Gemara, also known as the Talmud. There's also commentaries to the Bible that have been written by the rabbis over the centuries. So those are commentaries too. There's Jewish thought that rabbis have written as well over the centuries. And there are she'elot uteshuvot, questions and answers. The fancier word is responsa literature. So we know throughout history that communities would write a question, or individual rabbis would write a question to the chief rabbi of their community, saying, Rabbi, I know the Mishnah and the Gemara, but this unique circumstance came up. How would you decide what would be the decision on how we're supposed to act in this particular way, whether it's about synagogue practice, whether it's about Shabbat or the holidays, or some ethical issue? And the rabbi, in a very detailed way, would go through the sources of the Bible, the Torah, or other books of the Bible, the Mishnah, the Gemara, and other legal sources to derive an answer for that rabbi. So there's a whole slew of responsa literature out there. from a whole variety of rabbis over the centuries. And modern Orthodox rabbis publish their answers, and you can access a whole variety of Shelot or Tshuvot. Most of them are written in Hebrew, though, so they are inaccessible to the average person, I would say the layman, but some are written in English. Our conservative movement, for nearly 100 years, has, instead of one rabbi writing answers for the conservative movement, has what's called a law committee. And this committee of 25 rabbis determines together issues that are unique to the conservative movement. So, for example, 70 years ago, the law committee discussed whether it's okay to drive to synagogue on Shabbat. So one would think that that's an easy answer at the time in 1950, because driving involved, and still involves, well, mostly still involves, unless you have a Tesla, lighting fire in your car. So when you don't realize you're doing that, but when you turn the ignition in your car, in a regular combustion engine car, you have filled up your tank with gasoline, and when you turn the ignition, a spark is generated, an electric spark, which lights the gasoline, which makes the engine turn on. So we know clearly in the Torah that it is forbidden to light a fire on Shabbat, so that when you turn on your car, you're lighting a fire. So that is, it seems like the answer to the question, can you drive to synagogue on Shabbat, should be a very easy answer, no. But there are other mitigating factors that go into deciding a question like this, because traveling on Shabbat would also involve, in the time of the rabbis and before, saddling a donkey or a horse or a camel and getting on to the back of that animal and riding somewhere. So that involves the animal working also. And the Torah clearly says you're not to have your animals work on Shabbat either. So traveling seemed in the Torah to be a no-no. You can't saddle an animal. You can't light a fire. These are issues. But then in the 1950s, after World War II, suburbs were being built and people were no longer living in tight urban areas anymore. So whereas up until the 30s and the 40s, people actually lived in walking distance of their synagogue, it started to be the case that synagogues were being built in the suburbs, and it was nearly impossible, not impossible, but more difficult for people to be walking to synagogue on Shabbat. So in other words, like give for an example here, our own synagogue in Olney. I made it, once we knew where the synagogue was going to be built, Lenore and I met with a real estate agent to ensure that we could find a house within walking distance of our synagogue. And there are a number of neighborhoods within a mile of Sharei Tefillah that are in walking distance. But many people today, many non-Orthodox people today, don't take the distance to synagogue as a consideration anymore, especially since the conservative movement said in the law committee as a minority opinion that it is okay to drive to synagogue and home and no place else for the bigger purpose of being in a minyan and maintaining a sense of community. That those three rabbis who wrote that decision, that paper, felt that those issues overrode and superseded the ancient prohibition of lighting a fire and of traveling on Shabbat. So it used to be that the law committees would produce majority opinions and minority opinions. Right, Bill, I'll get to your question in a moment. Does this the committee used to produce majority and minority opinions, and usually rabbis, then individual rabbis in the field, would normally follow just the majority opinion, not the minority opinion. The minority opinion is there as a possibility, but usually the rabbi would follow the majority opinion. Today, they don't produce majority or minority opinions. They produce opinions that get requisite votes. As long as you have the paper gets the requisite amount of votes from the committee, it is then a viable paper that can be followed by all rabbis. So it takes the label majority minority away and just has options for rabbis to follow. Bill's question is: is the committee the committee's jurisdiction is over the whole Jewish world, the conservative movement Jewish world outside of Israel? Israel has its own law committee that deals with issues that are specific to Israel itself. And the nature of the Israeli Jewish community is a little bit different than the North American or European or South American Jewish community. So our law committee from New York handles the whole Jewish world outside of the state of Israel. So many issues have been dealt with by the law committee. So not just driving on Shabbat, but also can women be counted in a minyan? Can synagogues be fully egalitarian? Can other issues that aren't necessarily unique to the conservative movement, but might have a specific, we might want to say something about it, like the role of including people with disabilities in the synagogue and in the community. Can someone who is blind read from the Torah? Can someone who is deaf lead the congregation in prayer? I'm just thinking of titles of papers. Can a neighborhood restrict the opening of a group home for people with intellectual disabilities? So it's not necessarily a conservative movement topic, but it's an interesting question that the law committee thought, we should have a perspective on this, and that way people will know where the conservative movement stands on a whole variety of ethical and moral issues, not just specific rich Jewish ritual issues. Okay. So now getting to our point of the live streaming today. So the Rabbi Joshua Heller, who's a rabbi of a synagogue in suburban Atlanta, is on the law committee. And so this paper was approved last week, literally last week, May 13th, by a vote of 19-3 with 3 abstentions. So, and it lists then, that's 25 people. The 25 people on the committee are Rabbi Aaron Alexander. He's one of the rabbis of Addis Israel. And maybe Susan Grossman, who's the rabbi of Beth Shalom in Columbia. She's been on the law committee for a very long time. Rabbi Dr. Judy Hauptman, who's a Talmud professor. Just coming up with names that you might know. Danny Nevins, who's the dean of the Rabbinical School of JTS in New York. And I don't think you would know any other Elliot Dorff, who's the rector or the provost of what used to be the University of Judaism in Los Angeles. So in terms of driving on Shabbat, so Diane, I see your question, and can you ride in a cab if someone else is driving on Shabbat? So that's a technical question. But an element of that will be answered. I would. Part of me does not want to go in that on that digression. I'd rather, because there's a lot I want to say about this paper, and I want to be sure we get it done an element of the answer to your question will be part of this paper as well. Can somebody else do work for you instead of you doing it on Shabbat? So the point of this paper is to try to understand technology on Shabbat. So there's some certain basic foundational points we need to know about Shabbat in order to understand why this is a question in and of itself about technology. So there is an understanding that Shabbat observance means not doing work. Okay, so Shabbat, in other words, we can understand Shabbat in the positive. Shabbat should be a day of rest. Shabbat is a time in which we are reconnecting to God and to Torah. So it's a chance to rejuvenate. So we could see it in the positive ways like that. But for the Talmud, and for Jewish law subsequently, it's all about the restrictions, what you can't do on Shabbat, okay? So some people see that as a turnoff, that there are these restrictions to Shabbat, and why even bother with these restrictions? It just seems too overwhelming. And I get that, I understand that completely. Okay, I have to, just a second. I just have to answer this text. I have somebody coming to fix something in my house. Okay. Life intrudes on a class. So the restrictions on Shabbat. And I understand that people are overwhelmed by these restrictions, but if we understand the underlying principles of the restrictions, then we can understand why the rabbis instituted it. And it's based on the Torah itself. The Torah tells us several times that Shabbat's supposed to be a day of rest, right? From the beginning of chapter 2 of Genesis, when God rested on the seventh day, therefore we rest on the seventh day, to the 10 Commandments, to other times in the Torah where it's reinforced. Shabbat is supposed to be a day of rest. We're told only 2 times that, so we're not supposed to do any work, our animals aren't supposed to do any work, and our maids and manservants are not supposed to do any work. But it doesn't tell us specifically what kind of work we can't do. It tells us, the Torah does tell us, not to light a fire and not to gather sticks, okay? So those 2 specific works, the rabbis expand that and come up with 39 categories of work that they say are related to the work done in building the tabernacle, the Mishkan, in the desert. So any work related to that is work that's prohibited on Shabbat. Now, when we get to technology, obviously the Torah has no sense of technology, right? That how can the Torah specifically foresee a time 3,000 years later when there would be electricity and computers and cameras? Absolutely impossible to foresee that. Instead, what legalists do, and this is true for lawyers and legislators in every single country, when you're dealing with new technology, how do you understand the technology in light of the legal principles that already exist, right? So when we see something new Jewishly, we have to understand that in light of the essential foundational principles in Judaism that already exist. So what are the underlying issues of technology that relate to the laws of observing Shabbat? So the technological issues include writing and creating and fire. So let me writing, creating, and fire. I'm going to write those down to make sure I don't forget to touch on all of them. Fire. For the rabbis, since electricity became public or commercial, what, 150 years ago, something like that, let's say, they're just rounding it up. The rabbis have tried to understand, can we use electricity on Shabbat? And it's an interesting question, because what is the electricity doing in the wires that we are benefiting from on Shabbat? What do we use electricity for? We use electricity to turn on lights. We use electricity to cook. If you have an electric stove, an electric oven, you use electricity to refrigerate your food, to freeze your food. You have electricity for toaster ovens, for dishwashers, etc. Right? You have electricity to heat your home. Right? If you have an electric water heater, if you have an electric furnace, electric air conditioning. So electricity is used as fuel. And therefore, one easy answer would be, well, since we can't use fuel on Shabbat, you can only leave it burning, you can't stoke a fire on Shabbat, you can't start a fire on Shabbat, then we shouldn't use electricity on Shabbat. But on the other hand, electricity is flowing through the wires. And just by flipping a switch, you're not necessarily lighting a fire, but you may be creating something. So you're not allowed to make something new on Shabbat that hadn't been there before. So you're not allowed to sew. You're not allowed to complete the construction of something on Shabbat that then is permanent. So flipping a switch might not necessarily be turning on a fire, but you are completing a circuit and making the lights go on. So for most people, electricity is seen in the category of fire, and in the Orthodox world, no one turns on electricity on Shabbat. No one will turn on a light switch or use any electronic device on Shabbat, even to the point of somehow unscrewing the light bulb that's in the refrigerator. Because when you open the refrigerator, you're turning on a light. There are some people who will even unscrew that light bulb. That happens to be an unintentional result of opening the door of the refrigerator. In other words, when you open when you use light on Shabbat, if you were to turn on light on Shabbat, you want the light on because you want to do something with that light. You want to be able to see in the room that you're in, just to see the face of the person that you're talking to, or to read a book, or whatever you need the light for. Nobody would say, hey, let's open the refrigerator so I can read my book, right? That's not the reason to open the refrigerator. You open the refrigerator to put food in or take food out. The fact that a light goes on as a result of opening the door of the refrigerator is a secondary action. And there are rabbis who would say that even the secondary action is a prohibited work on Shabbat. And that gets into a whole complicated scenario of work and understanding the legal elements of this that I really don't want to get into, but just understand how complex these questions are that the rabbis are dealing with. And that's the secondary action, which would be similar to using hot water on Shabbat. Because there are some people who will not use the hot water on Shabbat because even a little bit of hot water, the hot water leaves the hot water tank. That means that cold water replaces it in the water tank, and that would prompt the pilot light to light, or the electric switch to turn on to start heating the water again. So by a secondary action of turning on the hot water in your sink or in your shower, you are prompting a fire to go on in your hot water tank, whether it's a literal fire, if it's like I have a gas-powered water tank, so therefore there's a literal flame there, or even electricity, you're causing it to turn on to by using that hot water. So there are some people, because of the secondary action, using the hot water itself is not necessarily a violation, but because it's causing a fire to light, though that wasn't your intention of using the hot water, that is forbidden for some on Shabbat too. Okay, so I'm sorry of going in that direction here, but there's the writing, no, there's fire and there's creating, and then when it's technology involved, there is a sense of writing. So what is the writing? It's the digital imprint that technology does when you're using it. So that essentially it relates to the idea of whether the stream that we do is recorded. So recording something on Shabbat is a, let me give a story. At my bar mitzvah in 1975, my father was not the rabbi of the synagogue that I became bar mitzvah in. My father was the educational director of the synagogue. He knew that the synagogue had a policy of audio recording the service for bar and bat mitzvah. My father told the cantor, please do not record the service for Jonah's bar mitzvah. The cantor recorded the service for my bar mitzvah. He did not listen to my father. So my father, so after like a week later, I don't know, my father got a package in his box at the synagogue, and it was the reel-to-reel, it wasn't a cassette, it was a it was like the olden days, a reel-to-reel of my, of the Shabbat service. Now, my father had said, do not record it, did not want it recorded. It was recorded, and we ended up listening to it, and I have no idea where that tape is now. But when we stream on Shabbat, I was told by Ira Kohlmeister and Jeff Winkler, who are the members of the congregation who run our streaming for us, that the YouTube is the software, is the application that we're using. They record automatically, and though they have been able to override the system in terms of being able to to program when the stream starts, which I'll get to in a moment, they haven't been able to override the recording feature, the automatic recording feature of YouTube. So in a sense, we can't help the fact that when we stream, it is recorded. It's just built into the encryption code of YouTube that's how it's done. And I'm not sure that Ira or Jeff know, though Jeff knows how to write code, I'm not sure he knows how to override the code. And so therefore, our streaming records. And for some, and for this paper, Rabbi Heller seems to be of the opinion that we should not be recording live streaming on Shabbat. And that even in this digital way, it's not a videotape, an actual videotape, which I don't think people do anymore. I don't think you can buy a videotape camera anymore. And certainly not a cassette tape or a reel-to-reel tape. Those things are forbidden on Shabbat. There's a physical byproduct that you receive after you're recording something like that. There's no physical byproduct that you get when you record a live stream. It's saved to the cloud, you know, whatever that means. Okay, so it's in the digital universe, and so when it's written or recorded, a series of ones and zeros and all other kinds of code is out there that is like when I'm recording right now. It gave me the option. Do you want this recorded to your computer or recorded to the cloud? So I said, record it to my computer. So somehow it's recording. I don't know where and how it's doing that. But when I end the meeting, then a dialog box comes up from Zoom saying, converting the recording now and saving to your computer. So it's this digital format that will be about an hour long that is saved to my computer that then I upload to YouTube, to my YouTube channel, so that makes a link available to everybody else. So what kind of writing and recording is that, right? So in other words, it's a whole new kind of idea. Because when we think about writing, you think about a pen to paper. And that's certainly what the rabbis were talking about when they said writing is forbidden on Shabbat. But is this kind of writing that I'm actually doing right now by recording this session, is that writing in the same way? So according to the rabbis of the law committee, it is. And it's not something that should be done on Shabbat. But if it's done secondarily because it can't override the system, are we allowed to use the recording after the fact? So that's a question that I have come down on the liberal side and say yes. Okay, so now this is a little bit of the background about the issues involved in streaming. So now, what are the decisions that we make as a congregation and other rabbis make to decide to do streaming on Shabbat? And why did we decide a year ago, thank God that we did, that we have this technology now to be able to do it. Why did we decide a year ago that we were going to do this as a congregation? So the supposed downside that Rabbi Heller brings up in his teshuvah of going to a streaming format. This is before the pandemic, before the virus. All things being equal, people coming to shul on Shabbat, sitting next to each other, hugging each other, like if only we could do that again. What would be the purpose of streaming? And I always said that the purpose of streaming was for May Savage. May she rest in peace, right? So it was for people like May Savage who could no longer physically leave their home and experience Shabbat with community. For me, and she, as we know, people, or those of us who remember May, we know that she came to shul every Shabbos. And she so much enjoyed being with people on Shabbat. And she happened to be computer literate as well. So that she asked if there was a way for me to be able to listen to the service, to be able to experience the service, I would love it. And then on top of not just May and other people like her who were confined to their home all the time, there are other people like family members of a bar bat mitzvah or any other simcha that was happening in the shul who just physically couldn't make it to our synagogue on Shabbat. There was just too much for them to travel the great distance to be with their family. So there's that other possibility too, to allow a family member to experience secondhand the simcha of their family member. And then also, there would be funerals during the week, not just Shabbat, that we could have this technology for as well. So for all those reasons, the board, the religious committee, and then the board agreed that we would start live streaming on Shabbat. And then, like the Teshuvah also recommends, we needed to let the congregation know that we're going to be live streaming, because there are people who just don't want to be on camera on Shabbat at all. So we have also, not just that we let the congregation know, but we have a sign in the entryway to the sanctuary to say that live streaming is happening and that people should be aware that this is taking place. So there are people who just don't want to be on the bima, and the camera field, as you know, when it was of the sanctuary, was a very narrow beam that mainly is of the bima, and you see the backs of the heads of one or two rows in the sanctuary, and also the sides of people in one particular section too. So that is an issue with the live streaming for people who might not want to be on camera on Shabbat. So the issue for Rabbi Heller and the law committee is, how does this impact the shul service itself? That there's a danger that with live streaming, people who are conducting the service, namely me and the cantor, would be performing for the camera. And that when we have live streamed before the virus, when we were live streaming, I think you would agree that I was not performing for the camera, and that I never thought about the camera that's in the back of the sanctuary on the wall, right by the exit door there. I never was playing to the camera. I never was looking at the camera, and I was never focusing our service for the camera. I would never do that. But that's a risk that Rabbi Heller and the rabbis of the law committee had thought was a factor. Now, with the virus, other factors come into play in terms of whether it's a necessity to be streaming on Shabbat, and which prompted me to say we should absolutely be doing this, and even moving from the sanctuary to the chapel, where it's clear that I am playing to the camera. I am conducting the service for the camera, because the community is through the camera. It's only Cantor Adina and her husband who are in the chapel. So absolutely, I am doing the service for the camera, which is really bizarre. It is absolutely bizarre. If I were by myself, like I am by myself when I Zoom on Friday evening, it is really weird, but it's less weird because it's Zoom and I see the pretty faces in front of me. But because we live stream, I don't see the faces in front of me. It is very, very strange. Now, the difference between the Zooming and the stream, so let me get to the community aspect. I felt that it is incredibly important to maintain the stream on Shabbat for the sake of community, for the sake of keeping us together as a community, and to experience Shabbat together in whatever way we're experiencing it when it's a one-way broadcast from me to you. Okay, so do I feel as if you're watching me? Well, that's sometimes, if I'm thinking about it, I mean, the cantor and I are singing, so we're busy singing and conducting the service, but I am thinking that there are people out there watching. And so you who are watching the live stream all by yourself or with your husband or wife or family, can you imagine that there's a whole other community of people watching with you? Well, that's hard to do, but yes, you should know that even last Shabbat, when we had trouble with the stream, which has been fixed, by the way, there were still 20 people watching who persisted, waited, and by 10 o'clock last Shabbat, the stream problem had been fixed. So even that, it's clear when there's an issue, you are still persisting with it and still to show that you need it, it's fulfilling a need. The problem for me with Zooming on Shabbat, which I'm among those rabbis who don't Zoom on Shabbat, but will live stream on Shabbat, is the work that's involved in it. Now, it's not physical labor, but I'm not a multitasker to begin with. And Zooming involves multitasking. And the Zooming, because of the problem with Zoom bombing, the way to get around the threat of a Zoom bomb, that is a stranger coming in and starting to either do anti-Semitic comments, which has happened to other congregations in the chat, or pornography on the screen. First, I don't allow people to share their screens. I'm the only one as the host to share the screen, so that could prevent that. And the other thing is I have the waiting room. So I have to admit each and every one of you. So there's work in the admitting of every single one of you that I just can't do in a smooth, easy kind of way. And I consider that work in the sense that even with understanding technology in light of Shabbat activities, that that I do not use my computer on Shabbat. No, the only electronic device that I use on Shabbat is my Kindle. So I will read a book on a Kindle, and some people won't do that because the Kindles have the ability to connect to Wi-Fi, and you can browse the internet on that. So I am disciplined enough to not do that on Shabbat, and I only read a book on a Kindle on Shabbat. So that for me is already pretty liberal compared to other rabbis out there. But I will use, and I do use electricity on Shabbat. I will use lights in my house. I turn off and on lights on Shabbat. I open the refrigerator and light turns on. Now that happens to be an LED light, and I don't think it's possible to turn off the LED light in my refrigerator. So I'm not sure that's a possibility for Orthodox Jews. I don't know how Orthodox Jews handle new refrigerators today with LED lights, but that's an interesting sidebar. But I will not use the electricity to turn on the microwave because microwave is cooking. I do not use the electricity to turn on the toaster oven because that's cooking. And I don't use electricity to turn on the dishwasher because that's also heating and doing work. So I don't use electricity to do work. I use electricity to turn on the lights. And when I'm in shul, I will turn on the microphone and I will turn off the alarm and I will turn on the lights. So that's those uses of electricity I do on Shabbat in my home and in the shul. But I will not use electricity for the cooking, for what the fire element of electricity on Shabbat. So Jan, thank you, saying newer appliances have a special Shabbat mode to program. You can turn, and Marlene is saying you can turn off LED lights with magnets. That's fascinating. Okay, right, you put a magnet on top. Wow, who thought of that? Okay, that's great. That's fascinating stuff. Yes, so for Shabbat mode in terms of the oven, right, so that's what we do too. So we don't turn on and off our oven on Shabbat, or we have a gas stove but an electric oven. We leave the oven on Shabbat on a low temperature so we can warm food on Shabbat because you can't cook food on Shabbat. And that you had to override that in the Shabbat mode. And all appliance instruction manuals have that Shabbat mode. And like you're wondering what somebody in Montana who buys a stove looking through the instruction manual sees Shabbat mode. What's a Shabbat mode? You got to skip that page. But it's just fascinating that a regular like Kenmore or Maytag will have Shabbat mode there in the manual. So because otherwise, if you leave your oven on, it'll turn off after 12 hours if you don't override the program, which would then defeat the purpose of having, if you turn on the oven on Friday at candlelighting time, being able to have warm food for Shabbat lunch. So that's the reason behind that. So all of that, that's how I use electricity on Shabbat, and that's how many conservative rabbis use electricity on Shabbat. But I do not use the computer on Shabbat because it's not just about work, it's about the spirit of Shabbat, which is another, right. And so Saul with the timers, yes. There are, right, I don't watch TV on Shabbat either, which gets to the computer on Shabbat because of the spirit of Shabbat itself. That something about this multitasking for me, but I think this is an issue for many people, to be inundated with information, like things just being put out there in front of you on TV or on the internet. It's just your brain is overwhelmed by so much information, and that process of overwhelming is not really a Shabbat-oriented activity. If you're supposed to rest on Shabbat, you kind of like let your brain kind of decompress. And using a computer is the opposite of decompressing your brain. And so that, I would argue, is not a reason, is reason enough not to use a computer on Shabbat and not to use a TV on Shabbat. But what happens if it's the World Series and it's Rosh Hashanah and you're a baseball fan and the Nationals are in the World Series? What are you going to do? Or it's Sukkot. I don't remember what it was this past October. Was it the Jewish holidays already? Maybe the holidays were over by the time. Yeah, the holidays were over by the time the Nats were in the World Series. So it wasn't an issue. But maybe the first rounds of the playoff, they were I think they were in the playoffs. So what do you do? So if you care about this issue of whether you use a TV on Shabbat or not, or lights on Shabbat, there is a loophole. You can put it on a timer. If you know how to set a timer, you can keep your TV on to the channel that you know the World Series is going to be on, or whatever, and keep it on, and that the TV will turn on automatically, or you can just keep the TV on all the time without a timer, and just as long as it's turned on before Shabbat and it stays on and you don't turn it off after the game is over, then that's okay. If you turn it on before and leave it on, that's okay. Or set it with a timer before Shabbat, that's okay too. You can't set your oven on a timer, even if it's possible to do so, because you're not allowed to cook on Shabbat. You can warm, but you can't cook on Shabbat. So there's a temperature beyond which when you're heating water, keeping coffee, or like you can set your coffee maker before Shabbat, which I do. You can and set it so it's turning on by itself at 6:30 in the morning when I want it to go on Shabbat morning. So yeah, that you can do before Shabbat, but I couldn't make coffee on Shabbat. You can do instant coffee, but you can't brew coffee. The brewing is the cooking, the instant is not. Okay, so now if live streaming is okay, how about my pay on Shabbat? Right, how do rabbis get paid on Shabbat? Right, I don't get paid on Shabbat. I don't get a check on Shabbat. That's a whole other question about how can rabbis and cantors work on Shabbat. So let's hold that for another time. I just want to make sure I'm finishing the issues that are here. So I've said that live stream is okay and that Zooming is not, because so here's how the live stream works. That Ira and Jeff set up the system so that it's turned on automatically at 9:30 in the morning. Also, it's turned on automatically at 6 o'clock, because the option is to watch the service at 6 o'clock on Friday evening if you don't want to Zoom. So that turns on automatically at 6 and turns off at 7. And the live streaming turns on at 9:30 on Shabbat morning and turns off at noon. It's automatic. Jeff and Ira don't have to do anything about it. The problem was, which they did not ask me about, is that last Shabbat, when the problem with the live streaming happened, Jeff took care of, Ira sent out a message to the listserv, which gets to the second part of this question. The fact that we're live streaming on Shabbat, I am saying to all of you that it's okay for you to turn on your computer to watch the service on Shabbat, even though I myself say I don't think it's appropriate to use a computer on Shabbat. So so there's a concept of leading someone astray on Shabbat, or getting someone to violate Shabbat. So that is a real issue that is in the sources over the centuries, that by saying that we are live streaming, we are saying that it's okay for all of you, whether you do it or not, and other people in the congregation, that it's okay for you to turn on your computer to watch the service on Shabbat. And that is a real issue that I considered, but I thought that the people who would benefit from the live stream are people who would not only use electricity, but generally drive to synagogue on Shabbat, so that they already make that compromise about Jewish law, and would make this other compromise too about using the computer on Shabbat. all I would add to this is that for those of you who are using your computer to watch the service on Shabbat, if you can access your computer with the least amount of clicks as possible, that is the ideal. In other words, if you're turning on your computer at 9:25 on Shabbat morning to watch the service at 9:30, you turn on your computer and you have to then open your browser. You might be tempted, oh, what does the New York Times or the Washington Post news this morning say? Or, I don't know, go to CNN or whatever other. So the recommendation from this paper is not to do that. Just go to sharetefillah.org and go to stream services and start the streaming. The least amount of clicks as possible. And even in the paper, they say, leave your computer on before Shabbat, disable the sleep mode and the screensaver mode so that you, before Shabbat, you have it already set to the streaming. And the only thing you have to do is click where it says click here to start the streaming. That would be the ideal. It might be very difficult and too challenging to disable the sleep mode, the automatic sleep mode, and the screensaver from happening. But if you know how to do that, you should do that so that it's the least amount of so-called violating the spirit of Shabbat when accessing the screen. Now, with zooming, there's a lot more clicks that need to take place, not just on my end, which is why I don't like it, but also on your end. Okay, so there's no way to set Zoom to be already on before Shabbat. There's just no way to do that. Not just for my end, but on other people's ends. Now, there are a couple of questions about using the phone on Shabbat. I carry my phone with me on Shabbat in case of emergency. In case of emergency, my phone is on and I have it on in case of emergency. So there was one time, a long time ago when we were in White Oak, that I wasn't, it was kind of a semi-mugging. And I won't go into the whole story. I was walking with Eitan. He was 4 years old, walking home from shul Friday night. A guy in the neighborhood just said, empty your pockets. So we were safe. Everything was fine. But that was really scary. And so since then, I just have the phone with me at all times in case of emergency. And God forbid something were to happen in the shul itself, I have the phone with me. I can call 911. So I have it with me. So do I use my phone on Shabbat? No, I don't use my phone on Shabbat on any other way, but I've answered the phone on Shabbat because, like, Judy Parrott called me last Shabbat to tell me that Harvey was near death. So for calls like that, I answer the phone on Shabbat in case of emergency. That's just what I do. And I just think in this day and age of technology, I don't think I can have the excuse that I will not use my phone on Shabbat at all. I just don't think that that's right or responsible for a rabbi today to say that. I just have to be available in case of an emergency. So that's the streaming and the Zooming, and why I feel uncomfortable Zooming on Shabbat and feel uncomfortable ever, even with the pandemic of allowing Zooming on Shabbat. However, I do allow, and why I feel comfortable with the live streaming on Shabbat. So it's 11:57. Any questions that anybody has, whether you want to type a question or actually just raise your hand to ask a question? Participating in a streaming of a minyan. Okay, very good. Okay, thank you, Gabe. So that will end our time. For the last 2 minutes, we're going to talk about how we can count a minyan this way. That's very good. Thank you for bringing that up, Gabe. Okay, so this is going to be very difficult moving forward when we're allowed to come into the synagogue again and have minyan again, even weekday minyan, whether we will still Zoom or not to help make a minyan. And there's this concept that Rabbi Heller mentions in this paper called, it's 2 Hebrew words, sha'at hadachak. an emergency time, or time is pressing, like an unusual circumstance is happening. So in this sha'at hadachak, which the virus is, which has imposed restrictions on our life, how can we, now, let me back up. We don't need a minyan to pray. Absolutely not. Okay, you can pray the service and fulfill your obligation of the mitzvah of prayer without a minyan. You don't need that. The benefit of the minyan is that you get to do things in the service that you can't do by yourself, like read Torah, open the ark, say Baruch Hu and a couple of other prayers, and say Kaddish. Okay, so you can't say Kaddish unless there's a minyan. So the question is this time, the virus time, enough of a sha'at hadachak to say that we can allow minyan to be formed by Zoom? The paper that was written a number of years ago says you can join a minyan by live stream or Zoom as long as a physical minyan is there in the room where the minyan is happening. So in other words, if minyan is originating in our Grossberg Baumgart chapel, and there are 10 people in that chapel, you can have as many people as you want joined by Zoom or live stream, and they can fulfill their responsibility of saying Kaddish because 10 people are in the chapel conducting the service and saying Kaddish. But now, since only 3 people are in the chapel on Shabbat, or when we had the bar mitzvah, 8 people were in the chapel on Shabbat, still there's no minyan. So how can we help people fulfill their responsibility to say Kaddish for Yartzeit, or say Kaddish for their 11 months of saying Kaddish? Is that enough of a sha'at hadachak to say that we will allow minyan to be formed in this way? So I, based on this paper and other papers that have been written, say yes, that it's okay for on Zoom minyan to have minyan this way. So that's why during the week, Monday and Wednesday evening, it's fine with me, and I think it's permissible to count our minyan this way. So I'm counting the screens, I'm seeing the people in the windows, and making sure that we have at least 10 people present on the Zoom screen. So that's fine for me for during the week. The issue is why we haven't done the morning service. One of the reasons not to do the morning service is how to read Torah in this way. And that's a question for another time. But now the question will be going forward, suppose 10 people showed up at the bar mitzvah. I'm making sure that 10 people will not show up at the bar mitzvah, because I have a problem with reading Torah. How can you read Torah when being socially distant? I haven't figured out a way to be able to do that, because the social distancing rules are still in effect. How can I read Torah with a gabbai 1 foot away from me on one side, 1 foot away from me on another side, and then a person coming up to have an aliyah? That violates in so many ways the social distancing rules. So I just have not figured out how to read Torah in a permissible way according to my mind, which is again a question for another time, and it's a question for the religious committee going forward. So it's very difficult, because I don't know how to read Torah other than at the scroll itself, and that's the only way I see that you can fulfill the mitzvah of reading Torah. Okay. So the Zoom. So going forward, since we've already now established the precedent that we have evening minyan by Zoom, how are we going to do this going forward when we're allowed to be back together again? I don't know, and that's a question that the religious committee is going to have to decide. Will we say that, sure, we'll do Zooming, but we have to have 10 people in the chapel? What about if we have 8 people in the chapel? Can we call people up and say, can you Zoom in so we can make a minyan? That's a question that our religious committee is going to have to answer now going forward. My personal opinion would be to go back to the way it was, that the purpose of the minyan is for the people who are gathered together physically together in the same room. I'm not convinced yet that we should maintain this beyond when we can open up again. Because I want to encourage people to come back together. I don't want to encourage people to be apart. and Zooming is encouraging people to be apart. It's filling a need right now in the virus when we're forced to be apart. I don't want to be in a position right now, that's what I'm thinking today, that I don't want to be in a position of saying the Sharei Tefillah is encouraging our community to be apart. And that just for the sake of convenience, we're going to make a minyan this way. So that's just something that the religious committee will be talking about in the future. So that's the issue with Zooming and the minyan. And I've made the compromise when we're live streaming on Shabbat. Made the compromise to recite Kaddish, and that many of my colleagues I know will not do Kaddish for the live stream. But I know how important Kaddish is to everyone, and so therefore I made my own ruling, which I'm allowed to do as the Mara Da'atra, the rabbi of the place. That's the Aramaic term for it. I have the authority, because I am a rabbi, to make a decision like that based on the sources and the way I've studied them, to say that we're going to do Kaddish on live stream because I know that there's a minyan watching. And even though each person is not in a minyan, there's something emotionally gratifying to know that, and an easing of a guilt to know that Kaddish can be recited. Okay. Any other questions or comments about this? I know there was kind of a rush to get through this, and I'm not sure I got through every single issue with the paper. I just commend you to the link and look. If you don't want to get through all the details of the paper itself, you can look to the end where the conclusions are to see which. Yeah, Saul, go ahead. Let me unmute you.
Okay, I've had the situation where I had to run a minyan, and there were 9 people there, and it was in the dead of winter.
Yeah.
And nobody wanted to be there. And actually, the person saying Kaddish was a woman, and she wasn't obligated to do it. But she agreed that if I could get somebody on the phone, in those days they didn't have Zoom, right. that person was Jewish, that she would say Kaddish. I know I've talked to you about this before, and you don't like it, but sometimes people, they will be loose in some ways and strict in other ways,
right? And
it makes them happy, and everybody else got home, early.
Right. So what Saul is saying, look, one of the issues is, obviously you all know that I'm not at evening minyan every single night, right? So, and I trust that the minyan captain, when I'm not there, the minyan captain and the person leading the service is doing the best they can based on the policies that we have on running a minyan. But I know that sometimes that's not the case. And I knew, may he rest in peace, Cantor Levin sometimes would open the ark and count the Torah to have the Torah be the 10th. I don't agree. I did not agree with that, but I knew that happened sometimes. Okay, so there are compromises out there that either I'm happy with or not happy with. Calling someone up and having them be on the phone, I personally would not agree with that. I could see Zooming someone in because at least you see them there, and the person Zooming can see if you turn the camera right, the person Zooming can see other people there. So I could see an argument for Zooming somebody into minyan, even though I still would not say when the virus is over that we should be doing that. But by phone is different than Zoom, and live stream is different than Zoom because you don't have the video perspective of being so-called present in the room. So, I mean, these are legitimate arguments, and an argument can be made pro and con for this that I think our religious committee should discuss whenever the religious committee meets again as policy going forward, what we should do about evening minyan going forward, also what we should be doing about reading Torah going forward as well. Is there a prayer to say in place of Kaddish when there is not a minyan? Yes, there is that prayer that the Lev Shalem has that you can say at home, and that's fine, and it's almost similar to the Kaddish, but again, for some people, it's not good enough. People who don't know anything else but know Kaddish, they know Kaddish by heart. They don't know this other prayer, this substitute prayer. So that's an issue too. The psychological impact that Kaddish has on our lives and I would say it's more important to be able to read Torah and to say the Baruch Hu than it is to say Kaddish. I mean, that's a whole purpose of being together in a minyan is the Baruch Hu and the reading Torah. And so how can we do that? Like high holidays is going to be an issue. High holidays is definitely going to be an issue. Even if we're allowed back in, how are we going to read Torah? Because we're still going to be socially distant when we come back in, right? Still have to be 6 feet apart. How are we going to read Torah on the high holidays? I don't know. I mean, I have an idea, but I really don't know how we're going to do that. And that's something that the religious committee and I are going to have to figure out pretty quickly. Okay, so we're going to stop here for today. I hope everybody stays safe and healthy. We have, if you're interested, the parrots are having a Zoom Shiva from 1 to 3 this afternoon with an opportunity for Kaddish at the end. And we have our evening service this evening at 7:30. So have a good rest of the day, everybody.
Thank you.
You bet. Bye-bye.